Knitting is a relaxing and simple skill to pick up, and after 3 years of knitting, I'm here to teach you the basics of knitting anything. The first prerequisite to knitting is yarn, and then you'll need a pair of needles. A pair of pin protectors on the ends of your needles will prevent your work from slipping off while you're not working. You'll also need a pair of scissors for when you're done to cut your knitting off from the whole skein of yarn. It's optional, but the more experienced friend who taught me would suggest a crochet hook to fix dropped stitches. With any skein of yarn you buy, you can check the label for information like how much yarn you have, as well as the yarn's thickness. This yarn has a weight of 4, which means it has a medium thickness. This weight is also called worsted. The label also recommends you use size 8 knitting needles with this yarn. The Boy Knitting Guidebook shows that different yarn weights call for different needles, so knitting needles come in a wide variety of sizes defined by their diameter, from smaller than 2 to larger than 50. They also come in the form of circular needles, with 2 short needles connected by a flexible tubing. They allow you to knit round things like hats without having to sew a seam. Today, I'll be using a pair of size 8 straight needles to match my worsted yarn. With your materials ready, you can start the procedure. I'm right-handed, so I'll start with the needle in my right hand. If you're left-handed, you can either mirror me or look for an easier lefty tutorial. I'll be using a slipknot cast on to cast 20 stitches onto my needle. Since you only do this once a project, I think it's easy to forget how, so I watch Annie Toe's tutorial to get a refresher. You start with 6 inches of yarn and make a loop. You want the loose tail end by your dominant hand, and then you fold the loop over the working yarn between your project and the rest of the skein. Then you'll get your needle, scoop up just the working yarn, and you'll pull to make a knot. The knot should be snug around the needle, but not so tight that it can't move, or you won't be able to stitch through it. This is how you'll cast on all of your stitches. In order to knit evenly, you want your stitches close together rather than having lots of slack. The best way to do this is to make sure your loops are small when you cast on. I'm going to do the same process we just learned and lift up that little bit of working yarn. Then I'm going to slide the new loop close to the old one and pull tight. That'll give you nice snug knots. With every row of knitting, you'll be transferring your work from non-dominant to dominant hand. You'll always start with your loops on top and work on the bottom. Knitting has 2 stitches, the knit stitch and the purl stitch, which you alternate to make patterns. The first I'll show is the knit stitch. The first step is pushing your needle through the top loop from top to bottom. Then you wrap your working yarn around the needle just once and go back through from bottom to top. When you slide that off, you'll have your first knit stitch. So I'll show you again. We're going in from the top and out from the bottom, wrapping your working yarn around, and going out from bottom to top. I'm going to finish my row like this, and once you finish a row, you switch your needles so all of your work is on your non-dominant side again. I have a few rows of knit stitching done, and now I'll show you how to purl. Once again, going from non-dominant to dominant hand, but this time instead of going top to bottom, we'll go in from the bottom and come out through the top. Just the same, we'll wrap the working yarn around the needle, and this time we'll go out from top to bottom. When you slide that off, you've completed your first purl stitch. Again, we're going bottom to top, then wrap around, and lastly, top to bottom. If a stitch slips off your needle, this is called a dropped stitch, and it can unravel down your work, leaving a trail of loose threads down to a loop. You must fix a dropped stitch to prevent it from undoing your work. This is where a crochet hook is useful. Push a crochet hook or a needle through the loop to bring the first loose thread back through. Once you've fixed that stitch, you pull the next thread through the new loop and continue until there are no more loose threads. You can transfer that stitch back to the needle it came from and continue as normal. The last step is to secure your work by binding off. Make 2 stitches, knit or purl, then lift the first over the second. You don't want to drop both, so carefully take the first stitch off of the needle. Pull Pull tight to bind off your first stitch, then repeat up, over, off until the last stitch. Then, with only one loop left, pull to make it larger. This is where you'll need your scissors, since you're going to cut a tail of a few inches. Snip it off. Lead it through the loop and pull it tight. When you finally trim that, you're done. With a little practice, you'll have all the foundations down perfectly.